Did you know that parents rank financial literacy as the #1 most difficult life skill to teach? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn to earn, save, and spend wisely, and parents can rest easy knowing their kids are learning about money with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/Wondery.
Find yourself looking for a new job or change in career? Monster.com is here to help. We are not only here to bring you job postings, but also AI interview prep and salary tools, expert career advice, and top-notch resume services. We've got everything you need to land your perfect job fit. Discover the magic of finding the ideal job with Monster.com. Your future starts now. Visit Monster.com today. Your next job opportunity is just a click away.
The Prosecutors Podcast is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations.
I'm Edward Conlon, host of Talk to Me, the new podcast about the origin of hostage negotiations. Through the first-hand accounts of the NYPD's hostage negotiation team founders, we delve into real cases, big and small, to hear how the team pioneered the use of psychology to save lives. Their motto was, "Talk to me." It changed policing forever. Listen to, follow, rate, and review Talk to Me now at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts, beginning October 19th.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, tell me, Susie, do you know anything about witches? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my witchy co-host, Alice.
Brett, look at you taking on my love of puns.
I know. Well, I've already called you bewitching before and enchanting, so those were kind of out. So
you were kind of limited.
You're my witchy woman.
Did you know I was watching, I don't know, probably some like morning talk show, and they said the most popular kids, like top 3 kids costumes and top 3 adults costumes, witches that appeared in both.
There you go.
Because, Brett, we've been fascinated with witches for actually centuries, and we continue to be today. And millennia, in fact. And I think there is a good reason, and we found this out when we started researching this week's episode.
What is the good reason?
We love to hunt witches. We've always
we do
hunted
love to hunt
witches.
That's true. That's true. It's a good point.
Did I have to answer that? Did you really not?
Well, I see
know
what you're saying now.
I was like, are we not on the same wavelength? Okay.
That was deep.
Tonight's going to be a rough recording.
I wasn't quite ready to go that deep right at the beginning, but you just took it right to the heart of this, that, yes, we have always liked to hunt witches. However you define those witches,
wow.
we have always liked to hunt them.
And also, I mean, I'm not just talking about like hunting witches or witch costumes. I mean, one of the greatest, biggest blockbusters of the last decade, 15 years on Broadway was none other than Wicked, which is an amazing musical about, you guessed it, witches.
That's true. And hey, witches go all the way back. You know, they're in the Bible. The Romans and the Greeks and the Egyptians all had stories about witches. There's been this fascination with witches. And I think magic itself is really, everybody wants to be able to do magic, right? I mean, wouldn't it be nice if you could just snap your fingers and the house would be clean? I mean, wouldn't that be amazing?
Like Elizabeth Montgomery in Bewitched.
Exactly, and Bewitched. And, by the way, if you've ever visited Salem, Massachusetts, there is a statue of Elizabeth Montgomery from Bewitched. And why is that? Because what is more synonymous with witches than Salem? And I got to tell you, I love Salem so much. I've been to Salem many, many times. If you haven't been to Salem on Halloween, it's basically Mardi Gras for people who love Halloween. It's the ultimate. One year, my wife and I actually stayed in Salem for a few days around Halloween. We went to the big Salem Halloween ball at the Hawthorne Hotel. It was amazing. It was one of the best weekends of my life. So, love Salem, and Salem has completely embraced its history, which we're going to talk about today. Its history with witches. It calls itself the Witch City. The emblem of the town has a witch in it. It's amazing. And if you're ever up in that area, even if it's not October, Salem is a wonderful town year-round. And we're not being paid by the Salem Tourism Board, I promise you. But it's an amazing place, and I hope one day all of you can visit. And if you live in Salem, shoot us an email, because I'd love to stop by and see you next time I'm in town.
I've never been to Salem, but based on today's story, I'm not sure if I want to go to Salem. But if you say it's beautiful, then okay.
Salem's changed a lot in the last 400 years.
Maybe. You might be able to convince me otherwise today.
But we are going way back in time. This is definitely the oldest case we've ever done. All the way back to 1692 to the Salem witch trials. Everybody's heard of them. The legend is burned into the collective consciousness of the American mind and maybe even the world. I'd be interested to hear from our international listeners what you know about the Salem witch trials. But there's an interesting question here. What really happened in 1692 in Essex County, Massachusetts? Why did it happen? And what can we learn from it? I'm going to go ahead and warn you, this is going to be a long episode. And even though it's a long episode, it's only going to scratch the surface of the Salem witch trials. There is so much here. You could do an entire podcast on this. So don't yell at us for the things we're going to skip, because we are going to skip things, but we're going to try and give you sort of the less romanticized version of what happened in Salem. But tonight, we will be watching, or I will be watching, I doubt Alice will be watching it, The Lords of Salem. Now, it's by Rob Zombie, so hide your kids. Probably not appropriate for young ears, but we will be watching it. We'll start at 9 o'clock like we've been doing. I'll be live tweeting it on Twitter. I've really enjoyed doing that with you guys. We've had a great time. This will be our last one of the season, but everybody knows I do this all the time. So, if you miss out during Halloween, just catch me on a Saturday night. But in any event, we're going to be watching that and enjoying that for a little bit more of the spooky take on what happened in Salem in 1692. Like I said, we got a lot to talk about, so let's just go ahead and dive in. And we're actually going to go even further back than 1692 to 1486. And 1486 was a very important year because it was the year that the Malleus Maleficarum was published. Now, before the Malleus Maleficarum was published, there were a few scattered witch trials, but the church, the Catholic Church, which was dominant at the time, had a very different view on witches than what you might think. For a very long time, the prevailing view was witches are frauds. There is no such thing as witchcraft because Satan doesn't have that kind of power in the world. So he couldn't actually give people power. So anybody who says they're a witch, they're either crazy or they're a liar. But there wasn't this notion of actual witches. But over sort of the 1300s and the 1400s, there were a lot of really bad things that happened in Europe. You had the plague, which ravaged Europe, killed a quarter of the population. And things like that made people question whether or not maybe there was more sort of an active evil power out there oppressing them. And then in 1486, this book, which translates to The Hammer of the Witches, is published. It's written by a man named Heinrich Kramer. And the book was as much about justifying Kramer's obsession with the sexual proclivities of accused witches as anything else. Kramer had been hunting witches for a while, but normally he would go into a town and he would get kind of thrown out of the town because basically he probably was a sexual sadist himself. He writes this book and all of a sudden it gives him this cachet he didn't have before. Kramer believed that witches hid charms in, quote, the most secret parts of their bodies, which must not be named, which of course required a thorough examination by him to discover. So you can sort of see what Kramer's doing here. But despite the fact that he's not a great guy, the Malleus Maleficarum starts to take off. And even though it didn't begin the witch trials, it popularizes them. And it popularizes the things you think about when you think about witches and how you figure out if somebody's a witch, the trials that a witch will go through, the punishments for witchcraft. All of that really comes from the Malleus Maleficarum. And around 60,000 people would be put to death in the decades and centuries after the book's publication in Europe. And half of those were in Germany, where he wrote this book, and 80 to 90% of them were women. So it wasn't that all witches were women, but the vast majority of them were considered to be women.
Wait, so you're telling me all of this witch hunting came about because this guy basically had like sexual obsessions and wanted an excuse to basically probably look at women's private parts?
Pretty much, yeah. That's kind of what I'm saying.
That's crazy. I really did not know that was, I don't say that lightly. I really didn't know that was the like genesis of these witch hunts. And it makes sense why so many of them were women. Because I knew that women were, predominantly the ones who were put to death for witchcraft, but I didn't know why. And this makes a lot of sense. If it was basically
I'm not going to say that there's no historians out there that won't disagree with me on that, but I think that's a pretty good take on what he was doing, at least.
Whew, okay, man. That really does answer a question I had, which is why it was so many more women than men. For lots of reasons, women had a lot fewer rights back in the 1400s, 1500s, but goodness gracious, well, there you go. And also, this tells you that books are important. They're very important when they're read by people.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
Okay, well, let's jump ahead. So that was in 1486. 1542, England under King Henry VIII passes its first Witchcraft Act, which punishes witchcraft with death. Now, 5 years later, in 1547, Henry's son, Edward VI, generally being more enlightened than Henry, actually repeals the Witchcraft Act. So it wasn't around for very long, and his son's like, this really shouldn't be a law.
And let me just say, it's one of the great questions in history. And I know I said we have a lot to talk about and we shouldn't do a bunch of asides, but I can't help myself. One of the great questions in history is, if Edward VI had survived, how different really all of history would be. Because Edward VI was this thoughtful, philosophical, kind person, very religious person who really probably would have modernized England in a lot of ways. And this is just an example of that, him repealing the Witchcraft Act. It's just an example of how he was. But unfortunately, he was a sickly youth, basically, and he died very early into his reign and before he could name an heir. And after him, you had Mary, who came in, and then Elizabeth I.
That's a great point of how much history would have been changed, because you'll see in 1562, Elizabeth I passed a new Witchcraft Act, and this one stuck. It would apply in the colonies as well. And if you know anything about history and colonization, England ruled like the majority, really, of the world at that point. So this Witchcraft Act applied widely. In 1603, the power to enforce the Witchcraft Acts are removed from the ecclesiastical courts and given to the secular courts. And the punishment was also changed from burning at the stake to hanging.
And that's, it's sometimes you'll see a trivia question, which is how many witches were burned in Salem? And the answer is 0, because by the time of the witchcraft trials in Salem, you didn't burn people at the stake anymore. You hung them. And so it becomes, it's not just a religious thing anymore. It's a part of secular law. It's a part of the state. And it's just something that it's like murder, robbery, or anything else. It's just a crime that everybody believes there are witches out there. And if we find them, we got to punish them and get rid of them because they're dangerous. And that's sort of the mindset that everybody's in. And look, one thing I just want to say from the very beginning here, it is very easy sitting where we sit today to judge these people and roll your eyes at these people and think this is all ridiculous. When I was at Harvard, I always like to talk about when I was at Harvard.
I think someone gets a bingo spot.
Yeah, exactly. When I was at Harvard, there was a guy there, and they're just it was such a weird experience being there because there were people like this. But there was a guy, and one of the things he liked to do was ask people if they had been alive in 1692, what their position would have been on the witchcraft trials. And of course, everybody says, well, I would have been against them, which probably isn't true, actually. If you'd have been alive in 1692, you probably would have gone along with them. But anyways, everybody says they would have been against them. And this guy was always like, well, I would have been for them, because that was society and that's the way society was, and you had to support the regime, and I would have been fully in support of them. And I never really found out whether he was just being provocative or if he actually believed that. But there was some truth to what he said, because this was sort of the universal view of people. This was the view of society. Number one, that witches were real. Number two, that they did really bad things. They hurt people. They caused crops to fail. They caused animals to be sick. They caused babies to die. They caused plague to spread. This was the view, and it was the view of people from the lowest commoner all the way to the King of England. So I think understanding that is a good thing when you think about this, because it's very easy to roll your eyes and laugh at these people without realizing that, as Alice said, there have been witchcraft or witch hunts for all time in one form or another, and it's very easy just to fall into whatever the prevailing view is, assume that you are righteous and just, and persecute people on the basis of that. And you see that across society. So I think it's good just to remember, one of the reasons we wanted to give all this history, just to remember what these people were sort of stewing in when all this started.
That's such an ivory tower, like, at the bar conversation topic. So, like, navel gazing. Anyways, I'm not saying that I didn't end up dating guys just less like that when I was in law school.
I think you married one.
I think I did marry one of them. So, I can only make fun for so long. Anyways, moving on with our timeline.
Moving on. So that brings us to April 1630, which is an important moment in American history. John Winthrop and a flotilla of Puritan ships arrives in the newly formed city of Salem. So everybody knows about the Pilgrims. They had arrived some time before in Plymouth. There had been other English settlers who had arrived in Massachusetts. They had formed little towns, but the arrival of the Puritans is a really big deal. So the Puritans, they have come to build a shining city on the hill, and that was their term. And it's going to be a pure church. That's why they're called Puritans. Puritan is actually a derogatory term that members of the Church of England would call them Puritans because they wanted to be so pure. And the idea was that, as someone said, it's bad to worship Satan. And I'm quoting from a book on witchcraft, so don't ascribe this to me.
I was going to say
but the
Bible.
Puritan view was it was bad to worship Satan. It was worse to be a Catholic. And the Puritans thought, look, the Church of England's great that they left the Catholic Church, but it's way too Catholic. And we need to strip the Church of England of every vestige of Catholicism. And we need a pure church, a church without all of this sort of the evil that the Catholic Church has brought about. And they tried to do that in England and weren't very popular. And so they had to leave. And so basically they decided, we're going to go to this new world, this new land, and we're going to create this pure church without all these Church of England people bothering us. That's what we're going to do. And so that was their thought of what they're going to establish in the new world. So they land in Salem and they begin to spread out. In 1636, a group of colonists settle Salem Village, which is inland. So Salem Town is on the water, as all initial colonies are. They're always on the water. So people start to move inland. They're looking for farmland. This is a more rural area, and they are going to farm. Meanwhile, Salem Town, which is the current city of Salem, is Salem Town. Salem Village is, if you know your Massachusetts geography, Topsfield, Danvers, those places, that is Salem Village. So they're going in there. They're going to be farmers. The people in Salem Town are going to be merchants. They're all mercantile. They're going to be selling stuff, shipping stuff. Well, it doesn't take long until there's some rivalry that develops between Salem Village and Salem Town. By 1672, they've decided to formally separate. And so the big deal there is Salem Village is going to get its own minister, James Bailey.
Oh, I feel like he's going to have a big play in what happens next. Religion always does in these kind of big factions, huh? Well, you'll find out. In 1680, a split forms in Salem Village between those who are pro-Bailey and anti-Bailey factions. And this fight will lead to a string of ministers being fired, hired, and even arrested, with tensions deepening between both internal factions in the village and between the town and the village itself. When Bailey is fired, he's replaced by George Burroughs, who walks into a situation which one parishioner in a letter to him described as, quote, "Brother is against brother and neighbors against neighbors, all quarreling and smiting one another." So this is a very tense time, even after the village and the town have separated. The village is facing a lot of internal turmoil. In 1683, Burroughs cannot overcome the factionalism, and the anti-Burroughs faction manages to run him out of town, kind of like his predecessor.
So you have a situation where you have all these people who are super religious, who are really into their church, and they become really attached to their ministers, and now ministers are getting run out of town. People are divided against each other, and some real anger and resentment is growing in this group of people. And the other thing you have to understand, remember, they came here to create the pure church. They think they are blessed by God. God supports this enterprise. So, to the extent it's not working out, one of two things is happening. Either God is disappointed in them, which they can't really understand because they've come here to do this, so it can't be God, or Satan is working among them. And if Satan's working among them, then they start to think Satan really is focused on us as Puritans because he wants to stop us from succeeding, because he knows if we succeed in establishing this pure church, the shining city on the hill that all the world will see, it's going to be a huge blow to his empire. So they begin to think, is some of this Satan? Is Satan here walking among us? And you can see how those thoughts gradually grow into, well, I wonder if Satan has some agents here who are working as well, and things are only going to get worse. So, in 1688 to 1697, King William's War breaks out between the British and the French colonies. Now, before this, some more sort of meta history here. So, James II becomes king in England. James II kind of likes Catholics, and there's a lot of people who are worried that he may be a secret Catholic, and this is a big deal because the English have done a lot to avoid being Catholic anymore. They really didn't like Queen Mary. They really liked Queen Elizabeth because she was totally on the Protestant side. But now James is sort of doing some things. One of the things he does is he revokes the Massachusetts Charter, which is a big deal. He revokes the charter, which their whole point of their charter was, we're going to build this shining city on the hill. And at the time, Massachusetts ruled itself. Under the charter, they had elections, they elected their own governors, they did whatever they wanted to do, and as long as they paid their money to England, England didn't care. That's not how James II saw it. He revokes that charter, and he sends English agents into Massachusetts who are loyal to him, who are now going to rule. So they're going to be the governor, they're going to be the sheriff. You don't have juries of your peers anymore. They have professional jurors who all just happen to be aligned to the crown. So if anything happens, you're going to be convicted if you're opposing the crown. So what happens is eventually the English run James out of town. It's something called the Glorious Revolution. King William and Queen Mary, who are both Dutch, I think Queen Mary is actually English, and William is Dutch. They come over to England and take over. The Glorious Revolution. William and Mary College is named after them. And when they do this, the people in Massachusetts arrest all of James's agents, kick them out of town, throw them in the dungeon. They do a bunch of things. The problem with that is James goes to France. That's where he flees. And guess what France is? Catholic. Guess what it also is? A new world power in Canada. So what inevitably happens is France and England get into a war, and they call it King William's War. And because the British are fighting the French, that means the British colonies are also fighting the French colonies. This is called the 9 Years' War in Europe. So the thing is, the colonists weren't actually that afraid of the French. There were a lot more English colonists than there were French colonists. But they were really afraid of the French native allies. They were really afraid of the Native Americans, who tended to side with the French because there were less of the French. The French were basically like, we're going to come over, we're going to get some beaver, we're going to sell them and make some money. We're not really that interested in colonizing the whole place. Whereas the British, all these people are coming over who don't want to be in England anymore for whatever reason. And they're spreading and they're growing. And one thing the English would do is they would ally with a certain native power and help that power conquer all of the other native tribes, which that's great in one way because now, the most powerful native tribe is your ally. But in the other way, you're making a whole lot of enemies. And all of those people are aligning with the French. And they're starting to launch attacks on the frontier. All of the colonies in Maine are basically burned and abandoned. Everybody's fleeing. They're refugees fleeing from Maine down into Massachusetts, down into Salem. This is a really vicious, terrible war. So at some point, Massachusetts decides we're going to take the offensive. And they decide not only are we going to be a part of this war, we're going to go on the offensive. We're going to attack the French. We're going to attack their native allies. But before they can do that, there's a smallpox outbreak. So smallpox starts spreading through Boston, the rest of Massachusetts. Smallpox is really, really, really bad. It kills 30 to 90% of the people it infects, depending on the strand. So there's one strand that kills 90%, there's one strand that kills 30, and there's a bunch sort of in between that. And the problem is, even if you survive it, it leaves you disfigured. It may leave you blind. Smallpox was the leading cause of blindness for a very long time until it was finally eradicated. In the 20th century alone, it killed about 500 million people. It was eradicated in 1980. It's the only human disease to have been so destroyed. Rhino pest is the other one. It's not a human disease, but it has been eradicated. And it was done through mass worldwide vaccination. But at the time, this is a terrifying disease, and it's seen as a punishment from God or maybe the work of Satan. They're in a war, and they have this plague that's ravaging them. Fun fact, tuberculosis is the most deadly disease in history, having killed 1 out of every 7 people who have ever lived, which is crazy, but and still around. So
you know a lot about deadly diseases, weirdly. But I mean, we all lived through, the latest epidemic, which was not nearly as deadly as this, thank goodness. But I can't even imagine the fear of living in the 1690s, with the smallpox ravaging through when all is as people are coming in, people are passing along this devastating, terrifying, disfiguring epidemic. And you can imagine how this could be ripe for basically brother turning on brother.
Alice, do you know the only disease that's 100% fatal?
No. Is this a joke?
Rabies.
Really? Mm-hmm. But you can stop it in time, right?
If you have the vaccine. When she shows symptoms, it's 100% fatal.
Seriously? That's terrifying.
That's why if you get bit by a dog, or if you wake up and there's a bat in your house, you need to go get rabies vaccine. Because if you don't get it and you start showing symptoms, you will die.
So as soon as you start showing symptoms, you die?
Too late. It's already reached your brain by that point, and it's too late.
How long does it take to reach your brain?
It depends. It can take from days to months. I think the longest is even a year after infection.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you have time, but you better act quickly.
Right.
Whew, okay, good to know. Look, I think you just saved a lot of lives today. You saved mine.
I'm glad to know that.
Okay, well, now that we've talked a lot about diseases, let's get to the Salem witch trials. Okay, on November 19th, 1689, so in the midst of the smallpox epidemic, Samuel Parris is named the new minister in Salem village. In October of 1690, the Massachusetts Bay Colony invades Quebec as part of the war under the command of Sir William Phips. Phips lands with 4 large ships and a couple dozen more support vessels, as well as 2,300 militia men. That is quite the invasion. And they demanded the city's surrender, at which point Phips was told that the French would deliver their answer through the mouths of their cannons. That's poetic. The Baymen were utterly defeated. At least 1,000 men died, and the whole affair cost £40,000, a staggering sum at the time.
This is a huge defeat, one of many. The United States in various forms has invaded Canada on multiple occasions, and despite the fact we make fun of the Canadians, we've never been able to conquer them. We always lose. And this is the first example of that, where Massachusetts goes up there, they try and conquer it, and Governor Fortuneau defeats the Massachusetts with this the mouth of the cannon thing, which apparently this was a huge deal at the time. It made it all the way over. This victory was celebrated in France. It was a huge deal. And and really a great morale lifter for the French in general. So this is bad. This is a bad thing. And you could imagine Phipps could have been in trouble, but he has a really powerful friend, someone named Increase Mather, who was an incredibly influential clergyman in the colony. His son, Cotton Mather, was considered perhaps the most learned man in all the New World. He had attended Harvard, of course, for his education, and was just the guy you went to when you had questions about anything, really. Harvard was started as a college for Puritan ministers, so that was the whole idea. It's going to train Puritan ministers. So during the 2 years that followed, Mather, he was fighting for a new charter for the colony. So, the charter had been revoked. Plymouth, the Plymouth part of the colony, they didn't even have a charter. Their whole thing was a protest against non-Puritan rule. So they didn't even have a charter. The Massachusetts Bay Charter had been revoked. There was no solid government around, and they wanted a new charter. And so Phipps and Mather became bound together in their fight for a new royal charter. And when it was granted, Phipps became the royal governor of the new province of Massachusetts Bay. And Massachusetts Bay basically included all the area of Massachusetts, Maine, part of New Hampshire. It was really big. But the charter contained one great disappointment that Mather deeply opposed. It granted voting rights to non-Puritans, and this represented yet another threat to the pure church. So you have everything that is going against this project to build a city on the hill. Disease, war, attacks by natives. And now, all of a sudden, the people that you didn't want to have any power in your colony are going to have power. Quakers, people who are a member of the Church of England, Baptists, just all these people you don't like, they're going to be voting. And all of this pressure is just growing and growing and growing. So Phipps, he's going to be the new governor. He's sworn in on May 14th and May 16th, 1692. The ceremony having broken off at sundown to celebrate the Sunday Sabbath. So basically he lands in Boston. They start the swearing in ceremony, but they can't get it done before the sun sets. Well, now it's the Sabbath. We can't do it on the Sabbath. So he has to wait till Monday. Then when the sun comes up, they go ahead and they do the rest of the swearing in ceremony. At this time, as he's being sworn in, the Salem witch hysteria had already begun, and soon he would be a part of it.
I know a lot of you were thinking at the beginning when we said that this is going to be a long episode and we're sorry for what we've left out. You're thinking, well, what could they have possibly left out? But this is awesome because you begin to see the environment and what's brewing and the factors that are making what's about to happen. It was just a petri dish primed for what we're about to see happen. October 16th, 1691. Tensions between factions in Salem over who should be minister continued to simmer, and a group of townspeople vowed to stop paying Paris's salary. On the same day in England, Phipps is named the new governor, though he will not arrive for around another 8 months.
And this is important because it's going to become important. You're going to see why. So Paris is now under attack in the same way that the previous ministers have been. And what happened to them? They got ran out of town. So Paris depends on, his job is to be the minister, right? So he's in a situation where the pressure's building on him and he can see what's coming. He's not going to make it. If nothing changes, he's going to be fired. And he knows that. And it's interesting to see what happens next.
The Prosecutors Podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Let's face it, sometimes multitasking can be overwhelming. Like when your favorite podcast is playing and the person next to you is talking and your car fan is blasting, all while you're trying to find the perfect parking spot. But then again, sometimes multitasking is easy, like quoting with Progressive Insurance. They do the hard work of comparing rates so you can find a great rate that works for you, even if it's not with them. Give their nifty comparison tool a try, and you might just find getting the rate and coverage you deserve is easy.
All you need to do is visit Progressive's website to get a quote with all the coverages you want, like comprehensive and collision coverage or personal injury protection. Then you'll see Progressive's direct rate, and their tool will provide options from other companies, all lined up and ready to compare, so it's simple to choose the rate and coverages you like. Press play on comparing auto rates. Quote at Progressive.com to join over 27 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Guys, you know how much we love Faherty, and we are back to talk to you about some of their clothes for this new season. One of my favorites, fall. And Faherty's all about clothing for life's best moments, whether it's a Friday night football game, the first day of school, or hanging with the family in your backyard this fall. They make clothes that feel good and make you feel good. And that's because they believe comfort and quality are key. They are passionate about craftsmanship and sustainability, and every piece is designed to be a lifetime favorite. In fact, their clothes get even better with age. And if anything happens along the way, Faherty will replace or fix your clothes for life, no matter what.
Brett, it's so true. I love the quality of Faherty brand clothes. No matter how many times I wear it, I wear my clothes hard because I'm running after two boys at all times, and they stay looking sharp and crisp at all times. And so you can find your new fall favorite at Faherty because legendary comfort awaits. You can layer your favorite pieces for a cozy fall vibe or get a one and done jumpsuit. I am in love with jumpsuits this season, and Faherty has such good quality ones. Or go with your best-selling soft and stretchy Legend sweater shirt that has thousands of 5-star reviews. Right now, Faherty is giving all the Prosecutors listeners an amazing deal. 20% off on every order. You heard me. You get a full 20% off your order. Head to fahertybrand.com/TP and use code TP at checkout to get this deal. That's code TP at Faherty, FAHERTY brand.com/TP for 20% off. fahertybrand.com/TP. Brett, with this new start of the school year, for some reason, we have just had so many birthday parties. Every single weekend, we're running from birthday party to birthday party, and it's hard to keep getting gifts that kids are excited about more than a day after they open it. And I know I'm thinking about this because the holidays are coming up. And my kids, they tend to open a present and throw it away after a few days. But now we have KiwiCo, which knows a thing or two about delivering fun for all ages. And they're here to help you give awesome. With a Kiwi subscription, you're giving so much more than a toy. They'll get a season of discovery and experiences delivered straight to your door. And each box is kid approved by a crew of kid testers who ensure they're age appropriate and seriously fun. I put in my kids' ages and they each got their own box that was definitely age appropriate. My 5-year-old son got this awesome science kit, and it completely coincided with what he was learning at school, and he came home every day wanting to show me new science tricks and experiments that he was creating on his own. I can tell already that this gift is not like others. It's here to stay, and it's also here to help him grow and learn.
And you know how it is with kids. They want to learn. They're creative. They're curious. They want to understand the world around them, and KiwiCo has gifts that are perfect for that. My daughter's been playing with her armadillo bowling set, which you might not think that's educational, but it actually is. She's learning about armadillos. She's learning about all the other little animals that live around them, and she's having a great time doing it. And that's what KiwiCo is all about. This is about more than just a trending toy. This is cultivating your child's creativity. And each box features new projects every month, like discovering the science of magic, engineering a domino machine, and more. You won't believe what your children can build and accomplish with KiwiCo. So, if you want to take part in this and you want to bring KiwiCo to your children, you can give awesome this holiday season with KiwiCo. Get your first month of any crate line free at KiwiCo.com/prosecutors. That's your first month free at KiwiCo, KiwiCo.com/prosecutors.
Okay, most of you have probably heard me sing the praises of Prose, the world's most personalized hair care. And for those who haven't, I want to tell you about the incredible results I'm seeing. since using my customized Prose hair products. It was so amazing. They truly took into account everything about my life, how I eat, how I exercise, to create the perfect hair care regimen. And since using it, it's been several months now. I can tell you guys, my hair has never looked shinier or smoother, and it's stronger too. I don't see split ends anymore, and I can just run a brush through my hair because it's so strong and shiny and call it a day for my hair.
I got to tell you, Alice, my wife has curly red hair, and those of you out there who have curly red hair, you know it is not easy to find good hair care products for you. And I got to admit, she was skeptical. She didn't know if this whole Prose thing was going to work out, but she took the quiz, she got personalized hair care, and she loved it. And I guarantee you, you're going to love it too. And if I turn out to be wrong and you're not 100% positive Prose is the best hair care you've ever had, they will take the products back, no questions asked. You have nothing to lose with this deal. Prose is the healthy hair regimen with your name all over it. Take your free in-depth hair consultation and get 15% off your first order today. Go to prose.com/prosecute. That's prose.com/prosecute for your free in-depth hair consultation and 15% off.
So January 15th through 19th, 1692, Samuel Parris's daughter Betty Parris and his niece Abigail Williams, who lives with him, began to have fits and act strangely, barking like dogs and saying that unknown spirits were pinching them. This continues off and on for a month. February 25th, the Parrises leave their children in the care of Mary Sibley. Sibley, like most New Englanders, knows something of simple witchcraft, and she instructs Tituba and her husband, John, both of whom are Samuel Parris's slaves, to make a witch cake so that they can determine who is bewitching the children. This same day, two other girls in the village, Anne Putnam and Elizabeth Hubbard, begin to show the same symptoms. Hubbard claims that a giant black wolf has been stalking her through the village. Hubbard says she believes the wolf was sent by a witch. Dr. William Griggs examines the girls and can find no physical cause for their symptoms. He suggests that he believes it is a witch.
So you got Parris, who's in trouble. All of a sudden, his daughters start saying that they are the targets of some sort of evil spirit. Now, why is this important? Well, the Puritans are Calvinists. They believe in predestination. The problem with predestination is you don't know whether or not you are predestined. You hope you are, but you don't know. But one of the ways to know that you're one of the elect is if Satan targets you. Because if Satan targets you, that means you must be someone that Satan wants to bring down. Satan doesn't care about all the people that are on his side, right? He doesn't care about the people who aren't predestined. But he does want to go after sort of God's elect, right? So by being attacked like this, Parris, who is under assault from all sorts of different sides by the people of Salem, all of a sudden it looks like he and his family are the elect. And how do you know that? Because Satan is coming after them. It wouldn't have taken long for this to spread through Salem that this was happening. And you see sort of a month later, these new girls start to say, hey, same thing's happening to us. And we got this evil black dog is chasing us. And we've talked about how witchcraft just wasn't something that was unusual at the time. People believed in witches. There had been witch trials in other colonies before this. There had been witch trials in Connecticut, which had led to people being executed, and dogs. Dogs had been accused of being witches and convicted and been executed. And there had been witch trials in Salem. So this wasn't sort of out of the blue. This is part and parcel with the world they live in. And it starts in the Parris household and it begins to spread. Other people see it and it begins to spread. On February 29th, the girls make a formal accusation that there are 3 women who are witches: Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Let me just say, it's also interesting that the only act of witchcraft so far is Mary Sibley getting the witch cake baked. She would get admonished for that, though she was never charged with being a witch. Just she was yelled at for relying on the dark arts to determine who the witches were. But in any event, Tituba gets accused. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Now, in some ways, these women are stereotypical. They're exactly what you would expect. Tituba is likely a native of Caribbean descent. So Paris had actually lived in Barbados for a while and had bought her as a slave while he was in Barbados and then brought her to Massachusetts. So she's sometimes described as African American, but I think the best sort of historical view now is no, she's actually a native Caribbean, Native American, basically. So that was her. Obviously, she's a stranger. There was a deep belief in the Puritans that the Indians were agents of Satan, and so it would not have been surprising that Tituba would have gotten this charge against her. Sarah Good was a poor, pregnant beggar who was not popular with the people of Salem due to disagreements with her and her husband. She was just generally not liked. Universal opinion of her by historians was she just wasn't somebody anybody liked. She was profane and annoying and just wasn't popular. So it wasn't surprising that she got tagged with this. Now, Sarah Osborne was a more wealthy woman, but she had gotten crosswise with the Putnam family before. And remember, Ann Putnam is one of the accusers. So her husband had been a Putnam, but he had died young. And when he died, he willed 150 acres of land to the couple's children. But Sarah stepped in and kept the land for herself. There was a man who was an indentured servant. She paid for his indenture, which meant he was then free. And then after she paid for that, she then married him and split the land with him, which really didn't make the Putnams happy. And it was also an affront to sort of the social norms at the time. And before she was accused, she actually had not attended church in 3 years due to what she described as an illness, but what everyone else thought was just she wasn't very faithful, which is something that is a big black mark in the Puritan world.
Well, things are starting to heat up now. On March 1st, the next day, judges John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corwin interview the accused. Hawthorne was one of the richest men in the colonies. Indeed, he owned most of Salem Village, now known as Danvers. He was heavily involved in the shipping trade in Salem town, and his house sat on a hill overlooking the town. That hill would eventually become the site of the Danvers State Insane Asylum.
Which, by the way, if you haven't seen Session 9, go check it out. That movie was filmed in the Danvers State Insane Asylum, which was eventually renamed the Danvers State Mental Hospital before it was converted into condominium. So if you want to live in an old mental institution, you can do it if you live in Danvers.
I know that's your dream, actually. Not mine, but yours. Okay, Corwin was Hawthorne's brother-in-law and the sheriff's uncle. So these are really powerful men in town. And he was essentially nobility. He was a wealthy merchant in Salem town. And so, like we said, they interviewed the accused. An example of Hawthorne's examination of the accused was something like this. Hawthorne: Sarah Good, what evil spirit have you familiarity with? Good: none. Hawthorne: have you made no contract with the devil? Good answered: no. Hawthorne: why do you hurt these children? Good: I do not hurt them, I scorn it. Hawthorne: who do you employ then to do it? Good: I employ nobody. Hawthorne: what creature do you employ then? Good: no creature, but I am falsely accused. So you can see the examination itself presumes the guilt of the accused. We would get objections right and left with these types of questions in court. Now, when the judges interviewed Tituba, they are stunned. Not only does she admit to being a witch, she tells them that there are many witches in Salem. Now things really accelerate. Over the next few weeks, many more people are accused. Martha Corey, Rebecca Nurse, and even Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter Dorcas, who was arrested and accused of witchcraft.
And you might wonder, why does Tituba do this? Because Tituba, man, she gets it. She gets it in some fundamental way. I mean, it's bad to accuse people of being witches when they're not witches, but I almost want to stand up and applaud this woman because she's a slave. You know, she was brought up here. She didn't want to be here. She's a slave. She's figured out this society. And one thing about this society is admitting what you did and asking for forgiveness is really important. And if you do that, the Puritans kind of feel obligated to forgive you. So one thing Tituba had figured out, if I just agree with you, yeah, I did that. Terrible. Shouldn't have done that. Really ask for your forgiveness. Here's some other witches. The Puritans are going to be like, oh, wow. Well, clearly she's repented. We have to release her. And so Tituba, who was the first accused, who, depending on the sources you read, and depending on what your definition of a witch is, may have actually been a witch. It's kind of hard to say. I mean, she did practice some sort of interesting things. There's some stories that maybe she and the children who initially accused her of being a witch, she did things like tell their fortune and do little tricks and that kind of stuff. She was more engaged in sort of the magical area, maybe, than your average Puritan. I mean, it's just, she's not a Puritan. She's of a different faith. So, and her faith may have just appeared to be witchcraft. But in any event, of all the people who were accused, she's the one who you might be able to say she is significantly different enough from Puritanism that we're going to call her a witch. But despite that, because she admits it and says she didn't really want to do it, she's forced to do it by Satan, and here's all these other witches, Tituba survives. She is freed. She goes on and lives the rest of her life. She never has to worry about this again. And it's a really interesting thing that because she admitted it, she is spared, but because she admits it in such a forceful way, everybody's like, oh my goodness, this is way worse than we thought. There's a huge witch conspiracy going on here. No wonder we've had so many problems. No wonder there's been so much fighting between people in the town. No wonder there's been smallpox. No wonder there's been war. No wonder there's been death. No wonder we have all these refugees here, because there are all these witches, these agents of Satan working against us constantly. We have to find them and we have to remove them. It's as if you're in the middle of a war. And think back to World War II. Occasionally you would find spies, Nazi saboteurs would be discovered in the United States. And it's the same idea. You're in this war against Satan, and all of a sudden there are these saboteurs in your society who are trying to tear it down. And it really speeds up at this point. So on April 18th, Bridget Bishop, Abigail Hobbs, Mary Warren, and Giles Corey are added to the list of the accused. Giles Corey is the husband of Martha, who had been accused after she expressed doubts about the validity of the trials. About the worst thing you could do is say, I don't know, guys, this all seems kind of ridiculous to me, because if you did that, you basically would be immediately accused of being a witch. Interestingly enough, Giles had originally believed the charges, and it said he was shocked that his wife would engage in witchcraft, but he didn't doubt that she did. But it turns out that Thomas Putnam, who, remember the Putnams are heavily involved in this, he had long held a grudge against Corey. Corey was a wealthy landowner who Putnam, it's a little unclear, Putnam may have really believed that Corey had murdered a farm worker during a violent altercation, or it may have been that Putnam had tried to convince people that he did this because that would mean that Corey would lose his land and maybe Putnam would get it. But in any event, Putnam had this big thing against Corey. So when his daughter, Ann Putnam, accused Corey, no one was surprised. But the assumption was not that you've held a grudge against him, so you've lied about this. It was you've held a grudge against him, so Corey, the witch, attacked you. And that's why you were attacked. But when Corey went to trial, he chose to stand silent rather than answering his accusers. We've talked about this before. You have a right to remain silent. It comes from things like this. At the time, you didn't have that right. You had to answer the question, but Corey refused to answer. Under English law, if you refuse to answer questions when you're on trial, you could be tortured to break you so that you would continue the trial and answer the questions. And hard torture was employed against you. Spoiler alert, eventually Corey would ace that trial. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But he won't answer questions, so he can't be tried at the time. In the meantime, the number of accused is growing, and it's growing so large that the situation has reached Boston. Now people are being sent to Boston to be examined by luminaries such as Cotton Mather, who we mentioned earlier. And Mather is convinced that there is a witch breakout, that this is real, and he begins to preach about the need to stop Satan's attack on the pure church. And it isn't long before people are being accused, not just in Salem, but in Danvers and in other places going all the way into Maine. There are people being accused of being witches because of this witch outbreak.
And this really is spreading like wildfire within a matter of months. Between April 22nd and May 10th, Edward and Sarah Bishop, Mary Easty, Nehemiah Abbott, William and Deliverance Hobbs, Mary Black, Mary English, Sarah Wilds, Dorcas Hoare, Lydia Dustin, Sarah Morey, Susanna Martin, George Burroughs, and George Jacobs Sr. and his granddaughter, Margaret Jacobs, are arrested. All are examined by Hawthorne and Corwin, and these examinations become public spectacles, and large crowds would gather to watch these accused be interviewed. Burroughs, you may recall, is the former minister in Salem who had been run off. He's described as the leader of the coven, a man who betrayed his position to become a king in Satan's empire.
And his accusation's a huge deal because he had been the minister. Now, he'd been run off, but all of a sudden you're saying that an actual Puritan minister is a witch. And this is, sometimes the Salem witch trials are presented to you as an attack on the poor. And they are, that's how they started, right? Tituba and Sarah Good. Poor women don't have a lot. Sarah Osborne, more money, but she's a complete outcast, right? It doesn't take long before it's not just the poor and it's not just the outcast. All sorts of people are being accused, including this person who is one of, if you're a minister, if you're a Puritan minister in the Puritan colony, it didn't get much higher than that. But even he is being accused of being a witch.
And that's a really big deal. Now, remember, all of this is in kind of the throes right before Phipps comes to Boston. May 14th, Increase Mather and Governor Phipps land in Boston. About a week later, May 20th, Sarah Osborne, one of the first accused, dies in prison. May 25th, in response to the uproar, Governor Phipps sets up a special court of Oye and Terminer to hear the witchcraft cases. It has 7 judges with the lieutenant governor as chief justice. Hawthorne is one of the judges, and Corwin will be very soon. So this is like one of his first duties as governor once he lands, is to set up this special court because of the just madness that's happening around them.
And what a big deal, right? The lieutenant governor is the chief justice. Like, this is not some provincial thing happening off in Salem. This is something that is occupying the attention of everyone in the colony.
Absolutely. So now, June 2nd, Bridget Bishop becomes the first of the accused convicted by the court. They did not wait long. This was like within a week of the court being established that they convict someone. Bishop is interesting in that she has been accused and acquitted of witchcraft years before. Bishop was known to curse people she didn't like, and a family who took a home in which she had once lived described finding voodoo dolls in the walls. Bishop was tried first because the evidence against her was the strongest. As we see, she was convicted. On June 10th, Bishop becomes the first of the accused hanged for witchcraft at Proctor's Ledge in Salem. So, within a week of the court being established, Bridget is tried, and then just a week later, after being convicted, she is hung.
And if it's important to you, it's often said that the witches are hanged at Gallows Hill, which would make sense. They weren't. They were hanged at Proctor's Ledge, and that's been established after a lot of historical research. So, little thing, but maybe important to you. So June 20th, Rebecca Nurse stands trial, and this is a turning point in all of this. Her arrest had been significant and a significant turning point in the witch hunts. She wasn't poor. She wasn't somebody who didn't go to church. She didn't fit the stereotype. She was a person with land. She had prestige in the community. She was somebody who was a pillar of the church. If she could be arrested, anyone could. And many people, dozens of people at risk of their own lives, signed a letter for her saying she could not be a witch. Here are all the reasons, which was a big deal. And her trial would mark a significant turning point. You had all this evidence that she wasn't a witch. There wasn't much evidence that she was. And at the conclusion of the evidence, the jury acquitted her. So she was acquitted of witchcraft. So the judges of the court of Oyer and Terminer did something that you couldn't do today. They asked the jury, and by asked, they told the jury to go back and try again. And when they came back, they found her guilty. And if there had been any notion that this was a fair system with due process, it was lost at that moment. And look, I just want to point out, this is so important because we talk about process all the time, both in this podcast and our other podcasts, how important it is. And we get people who will say, that's what's wrong with this whole system. You talk about process, not justice. I mean, you need justice, not process, right? Well, process ensures justice. And when you don't have process, what you get is something like this. The judges of Oyer and Terminer thought they were doing the right thing. They thought they were doing justice. And they were so sure that they were right. And they were so sure that what they were doing was just and the right thing and the moral thing and the only thing you could do, that they violated fundamental processes. And they told this jury, you're wrong, go back and find her guilty. And so they did. And that was the end of any notion that this was a fair trial where somebody who was accused of witchcraft could be acquitted. From that point forward, every trial was a fait accompli. Every trial meant guilt. And that's what Rebecca Nurse faced.
Now, July 19th, after being found guilty, Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds were led to the gallows. Reverend Nicholas Noyes called Good a witch and urged her to confess. She replied, "You're a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. And if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." The women were hanged and buried in an unmarked grave. At the same time, more and more people are being accused. The number will eventually reach over 100. About a month later, on August 19th, John Proctor, George Jacob Sr., George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, and John Willard are convicted and also hanged. Really, just like Brett said, these trials are not really trials at all in any sort of a fair sense. They are just a process on the way to the gallows.
And we're about to have a hero in all this. And somebody who, I don't know how good a guy he was. Maybe he murdered somebody. I don't know. But, you know, sometimes people have one moment in their lives where they decide to do the right thing and it changes everything. And that is what we have here. So on September 18th, Giles Corey was put to the press. So this is the torture they're going to use to force him to talk. He has been refusing to take part in his trial, so now they're going to press him. So what that means is he is stripped naked, a board is laid across his body, and stones are slowly added. So you continuously add weight to this person, and it gets heavier and heavier and heavier and more painful. And the thought is eventually, after enough weight has been added, you will confess. This lasted for a full 2 days. It continued into the next day. As the weight is increased, there's this expectation that Giles Corey, who is in his 80s, eventually will speak. And Corey did speak. And when he did, there was a magistrate there waiting for him to confess, to say everything they wanted to say. He says something. This magistrate can't hear him. So he bends down to hear better the sort of mumbled words that Corey is speaking. And so Corey repeats it. More weight. Corey's body broke, but his spirit never did. He died by the press on September 19th. But the public way in which he died and the extreme bravery he showed shook the confidence of many in the ongoing trials. And this story spreads across New England, that this person who's being accused of a witch did this, stood up to this torture and died in this torture and never confessed, never spoke. And for the first time, people began to publicly criticize Hawthorne and Corrin, who were seen as the leaders of this. But unfortunately, it's not soon enough to save the last victims.
On September 22nd, Martha Corey, Alice Parker, Margaret Scott, Ann Pudeter, Mary Eastie, Samuel Wardwell, Wilmot Red, and Mary Parker are all hanged at Proctor's Ledge. These are the last of the hangings. So note, this has been like a 6-month fury. On October 8th, Thomas Brattle, one of the richest men in all the colonies, writes a letter condemning the witch trials. Fearing no man, he makes it public. At the same time, a new accusation is made against the wife of Governor Phipps. On October 12th, Governor Phipps puts an end to any new witchcraft cases in Salem and bans any new publications about the trials. Soon thereafter, he dissolves the court of Oyer and Terminer. In the months that follow, local witch trials sputter along, but Phipps stays all of the executions. On February 16th, 1693, the parishioners in Salem turn once and for all on Paris, whose children began the witch trials. He is eventually fired from the position, which, remember, had been in the works a year earlier.
And so at this point, Phipps, who had supported this, and then his wife gets accused, and his biggest supporters are saying, don't do this anymore. He writes a letter to the king and says, hey, there's this whole witch thing going on. We're thinking about stopping it. What do you think? Well, April 15th, 1693, Queen Mary issues a royal letter to Governor Phipps ordering that he stop all witchcraft trials. So they stop all the trials at this point. A lot of the people, Corwin and Hawthorne, are not happy about this, but the king and the queen have made their stand on this. That's the end of this. And it doesn't take long at all for people to realize, wow, we really messed up. By January 14th, 1697, the General Court, which is the governing body of Massachusetts, orders a day of fasting and prayer in honor of the victims of the Salem witch trials, and not the people who accused people of being witches, but the people who had been executed as witches. So 1697, only 5 years later, the General Court is ordering everyone to take a day to remember what they have done. At this point, the families of the victims are starting to appeal for clemency. They want the names of their family members to be cleared. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature, which exists by this point, passes a bill clearing the name of some of the accused, including the Coreys. So the Coreys are some of the first people whose names are cleared because of this. In 1717, Reverend Noyes, who you may recall, had told Sarah Good that she needed to admit she was a witch, and she told him, if you follow through on this, the Lord will make you drink blood. 1717, Reverend Noyes suffers some sort of hemorrhage and chokes to death on his own blood.
Some sort of justice there. Now in 1735, England repeals its Witchcraft Act and replaces it with a new bill punishing those who claim to be witches as frauds. 1782, Switzerland conducts the last execution of a supposed witch in Europe. So this actually lasts for a while still. July 29th, 2022 of this year, Massachusetts exonerates Elizabeth Johnson, the last of the accused to receive a pardon. All told, 19 people were hanged, 5 died in jail, and Giles Corey was pressed to death. Whew, what a history.
Yeah, and it's kind of crazy that the history didn't really end until this year. And it's crazy to me. I mean, Massachusetts has basically, over the last 300, 400 years, been in the process of exonerating people, but it literally took until this year to exonerate the last accused witch. Now, Elizabeth Johnson was not executed. She actually survived, but she was accused of witchcraft. And, you know, it's a crazy time in history. It is a really interesting time because of all the things that were going on. And there are a lot of great books on it. There's a great book called A Storm of Witches. Check it out if you want a deep understanding of this. If you want to see sort of the Puritan side of it, there's a book called Wonders of the Invisible World, sometimes also called On Witchcraft, which was written by Cotton Mather after the witch trials were over, sort of justifying the witch trials. And it's a fascinating read, too. But that's the end of the timeline, which is the majority of what we're going to do. But we do want to talk about some of the factors that went into this. And the first one is something we sort of touched on a little bit earlier, which is the advantage of admitting what you did. So, like I said, the Puritans really believed in the power of confession. And so if you admitted you were a witch, they would let you go. And if you look at the people who were executed versus the people who survived, there are over 100 people accused of being witches. And a lot of them confessed, which is crazy to think about. We talk about false confessions sometime, and I would love to have sort of an expert on this. I don't know if there is an expert on this, but just the psychology of false confessions. But you had people who were accused of being witches and said, yep, I'm a witch. And you got to wonder, did they get it? Kind of like Tituba did? Did they get it that if they confessed, they would survive? There was one tranche of people who were accused, and all of them confessed. And none of them were executed except one person. And the only person from that tranche who was executed was the person who retracted their confession. So afterwards they said, you know what? I lied. I didn't do this. I'm innocent. They got executed. And it's just wild to believe that that's how it went. But once again, the psychology of this society is a really important thing to remember. And there was this notion that you become a witch because you're tempted into it. Satan is a predator seeking who he may devour, right? And there's a sense of you were tricked into it. You were tricked into it. And if you recognize that and accept that you made a mistake, we'll forgive you. But if you don't, we won't. We talked about Rebecca Nurse. Rebecca Nurse was absolutely adamant. And they begged her to confess. They wanted her to confess so bad because they didn't want to execute her. And they begged her, and she would say, I cannot confess to something I did not do. God knows that I'm innocent, and that's all that matters. That was her position. And just at the end of the day, they could not accept that. They could not have someone deny this when everybody knew that they were guilty. And if they denied it, they had to be punished, and they had to be executed. They had to be removed altogether from the society. So you had this strange thing that denying you were a witch was proof that you were one.
Another unusual aspect is the value of being afflicted. So Calvinists, remember, we talked about how they believe in predestination. So there's the chosen and the not chosen, and you can't really do anything about it, but God knows whether you're going to heaven or not. So how can you, as a human who's not God, know if you were one of the elect who was predestined to go to heaven? If Satan chose to target you, then that was proof that you were one of the Lord's chosen people, because why would Satan waste his time on someone who was predestined for hell already?
And there was this whole thing going on in the Protestant church in Massachusetts at the time, the Puritan church, where the original Puritans had all had this sort of spiritual experience and they knew they were the elect, but their children didn't. And so it was like, how are your children going to prove that? Because they didn't cross the ocean to form the new Puritan church. They were just born into it, right? And if you weren't one of the elect, you couldn't baptize your kids. Like, you just couldn't do all these things. It's a very interesting sort of religious thing going on. And you couldn't be a member of the church. And so they had this like half membership where they thought you were one of the elect, but they weren't really sure, but they'd go ahead and let you be a member, but then you could baptize your kids. But then you had this old line group of people who said, that's one of the problems. That's why we're having all these issues, is because we've watered down the church. So this was really valuable. All these witches were incredibly valuable to these people, because it's like, I've had my spiritual experience. Satan himself has attacked me. Clearly, I am one of the elect. I get to be a full member of the church. My kids get to be baptized. We're all going to heaven. Congratulations, right? There was so much value in being afflicted. It's not surprising that so many people claim to be. And there's also political value. One of the accusers was a Quaker, and she actually was Benjamin Franklin's aunt. So Benjamin Franklin's mother's sister lived in Salem and was a Quaker. Quakers were a religious minority. They were shunned and frowned upon and didn't have a lot of rights. But what they could do was accuse you of being a witch. So she's one of the people who was one of the accusers. And it's just interesting to think about all the value that you had to being an accuser. And you had a trump card. If you were an accuser, you could point to something called spectral evidence. So it was believed at the time that every person has a specter. So basically you have a soul, but you can send that soul out to do things. And it was believed that witches could send out a spectral image of themselves to torment their victims. So we talked about earlier, they're being pinched, they're being tormented by this unseen attacker. Well, in fact, that was the specter of the witch. But they weren't entirely unseen. The victims could see them. So you can imagine the danger of this kind of evidence. You had victims who would testify, Sarah Good's specter came and attacked me. There's no proof of that beyond what she said. No one could see it other than her. She is the only one. How do you deny that? How do you say that didn't happen? You couldn't see it, so of course you think it didn't happen. And spectral evidence was incredibly powerful because it was basically, you could not refute it. There was no cross-examination that could refute this. And in fact, when the accusers were cross-examined, one of the things that would often happen is they would fall into a fit. And so they would basically, as they're being questioned, say that the specter of the accused was attacking them. And this was very powerful evidence for the court. They're like, see, Satan is so in your corner, he doesn't even want questions asked about you. And that's why this is happening. So you can see how this all just sort of built on itself. And it really was just impossible to ever refute this if you're one of the accused.
So what caused this? Because how could it be that all these victims were somehow seeing specters of these accused witches? Maybe it was ergot poisoning. Maybe you haven't heard of it, but you see, there's this like fungus that can grow on certain types of grains like wheat or rye. And this ergot fungus will metabolize when you eat it into LSD. And what it can cause in people is like twitching, hallucinations, dizziness, psychosis. So what if there was this fungus growing on all the wheat that people were eating in Salem and along the coast up to Maine, and what people were seeing was really them tripping on LSD?
This is a really popular theory that is almost certainly wrong. Like, there's no way this is ergot poisoning.
I don't think everyone was just tripping.
Yeah, exactly. And as people have pointed out, the only time these people suffered this were convenient times. You know, they didn't just happen to have ergot poisoning when they were in the trial and the person was saying they didn't do it, and then all of a sudden they fall into a fit because of ergot poisoning. This is not ergot poisoning. It can happen. It can cause hallucinations. It's an interesting theory. It's a sexy theory. It's fun to think about. Maybe it could have happened in isolated incidents. Maybe it did happen in isolated incidents. That is not what caused dozens of people to accuse hundreds of people across vast swaths of territory of being witches.
Yeah. So while it's sexy, I don't actually think that's what happened. There we go, cold water prosecutors. So, Brett, were there actually witches during this time, or was it just either wheat poisoning or people trying to attack each other so they weren't attacked? Or was there really something darker at play?
We talked about Tituba a little bit, and you could imagine how just the foreignness of her faith and her religion, whatever she grew up with in the Caribbean, could have been seen as witchcraft by the Puritans. You could see that, you know. I mean, there's a lot of people today who practice sort of very naturalistic religions. Wicca is one of them who, you know, if you were somebody who was hyper-religious and in this hyper-religious place that the Puritans were, where even, as we said, I mean, Catholics, like fellow Christians are horrible Satanists, right? Well, if fellow Christians are horrible Satanists, then what are people who have some, you know, worship of anything natural? Like, you can imagine how they would see that as witchcraft. And obviously, this all starts when they bake this witch cake and they use that to figure out who did it. So there is a little bit of actual witchcraft kind of going on here. Now, do I think there was a coven of witches who were going around, you know, poisoning the wells and pinching teenagers? No, probably not. I think the question of whether or not they're actual witches is actually really interesting. In the turn of the 19th century, there was this belief that there were actual witch cults of the Western world. And there were books written about it. Most of them have been thoroughly debunked. I don't think they were actual witches. I would be interested to know what people think about that, though. I mean, when I was in philosophy classes, I was a philosophy major in college, and I had one professor who would use the word witch as a word that doesn't mean anything. And the whole idea was there's no such thing as witches. So this word actually has no content. It's a word we have, but it doesn't really have any content. And that's sort of a weird philosophical thing that we don't need to get into now. But nevertheless, like this notion of, is there any truth to any of this? To any of the sort of folklore about witches, you know, gathering on the mountain on Valpurgis night to worship their dark master or whatever. I don't know. I think it's interesting, and we're at Halloween, so we can talk about this stuff. But I think it's definitely the case that there were no actual witches in Salem or in the environs that were trying to bring down the pure church.
I think that's right, Brett. And it's very interesting. This whole case fascinated me because of the historical timeline to see what leads to this type of hysteria that can climax so quickly and lead to so many deaths with entire societies being a part of it, and also how it quickly shut down. It was a relatively quick flame up. Thank goodness it didn't, afflict more people. But I think there's a lot of historical lessons to be learned here in terms of how something like this, which I think had no real basis, in fact, could have been condoned by everyone in society, and then finally, when it comes into your backyard, essentially, you put an end to the hysteria. You've got to think Phipps, he didn't just end it because of his wife. If he really believed in it, then he would want his wife to die. But part of the reason it went away so quickly is kind of the farce that I think maybe people knew and were afraid to point out because it meant that they would be the next victim of this hysteria.
And I think that's right. And I think what happened here is, in reality, this is just a really complicated combination of political, religious, social pressures that are all building and finally explode in Salem. And Salem wasn't the only place in the New World that had witch trials. The numbers pale in comparison to the number of people who were executed in Europe around the same time for witchcraft. But for whatever reason, because it happened in such a compressed period of time, and right at the end, it's always interesting. You think about the things that you remember. In some ways, there are a lot of tragedies that happen that are they're at the end of a period of tragedy, right? So there had been witch trials for centuries, but they were coming to a close. Within 100 years of Salem, there would never be a witch trial again. And so the fact that it's happening right there, I think, is one of the reasons that it's so famous. But there's a reason that the witch trials have become synonymous with generalized moral panics. The Crucible, which is a play that was based on the witch trials, was all about sort of the communist panic in the 50s. And you see these sort of moral panics happen again and again and again, and they can come from all sorts of different places. They can come from religion, they can come from politics, they can come from societal pressures, they can come from the right, they can come from the left, they can come from anywhere. But all it takes is enough people who have blind belief in a certain thing and are willing to demonize anyone who disagrees with them. That's all it takes. And then you can have a witch hunt. And this Salem wasn't the last one, and it certainly won't be the last one. And I think it's interesting to think about it, like we said at the beginning, to think about it as more than just, point and laugh at these people because they're so backwards and they were so simplistic in the way they think. Any of us could be these people. And I think it is really important for people to remember, going back to that guy at Harvard, it's really important for people to remember that if you were alive in 1692 in Salem, you probably would have gone along with this. There aren't many Giles Coreys. There are very few. And because of that, because of the simple fact that you probably would have gone along with this, I think it's really important that all of us, and I include myself in this, all of us, when we get all fired up about something and we're ready to condemn somebody and we're ready to attack somebody, just take a moment and think about whether or not you're getting swept up in something that maybe you should step back from. I think that's really important. I think that's a lesson you can take from this. And I wish I could say that, the last witch trial was in 1692, but it was not.
That's a really good point. And also very convicting. But I will say, I never knew how I felt about the phrase, it's a witch hunt. I was like, is that, I don't know. But now having gone through the history of the Salem witch trials, I think it's a very apt term, truly chasing something that is not rooted in fact and perhaps run on emotions and, motives that are not based in fact. So this was fascinating for us. I hope you guys enjoyed the history lesson because I certainly did.
I could talk about this forever. I love this stuff. This stuff's amazing. Check out that book, The Storm of Witches. It's really good. We're going to link to some other podcasts and other things that have talked about this. Massachusetts does a fantastic job on this. There's a website we're going to link to that has more information than you could ever want on the witch trials. I mean, we skimmed so much of this. It's really fascinating just to look at the background and the history of the people who were accused. Because if you do that, you begin to see how deep these accusations were. We talked about a few of them. We talked about Burroughs. We talked about Good. We talked about Nurse. And every Osborne, every one of these, there was a history there that mattered. There was a reason. It wasn't random. These people weren't accused at random. And I think when you read that and when you recognize that, you will see that, like the ergot poisoning, it wasn't that random. This was so deep-seated in this community. And basically, people just decided, if I've had a dispute with you before, well, now I know why. It's because you're a witch. And it happened that way. And a lot of adults were using their children to sort of push this. And there's endless things you can learn and think about when it comes to this case. So I hope you guys will check out some of those resources and read more deeply into this. Well, thank you guys so much. We're really interested to hear what you think. Shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media. Check us out on YouTube. Join our Patreon, where every episode is early and ad-free. So if you hate the ads, don't complain. Join the Patreon. And we want to hear what you guys want us to cover. It drives so much of what we do in this show and in our other show, Legal Briefs. We really like talking about the things that interest you. I do want to wish everyone a happy Halloween. And for those of you who celebrate, blessed be to all of you. Well, Alice, do you have anything else you want to say?
Happy Halloween to you, Brett. I know this is your Christmas.
It is my Christmas.
I hope you've enjoyed
so
it
much.
because it's been really fun. And I'm glad you take me along the ride because I would never celebrate all of these scary things without you.
Right. And next week, we'll just be back to the ordinary, non-scary murderers and kidnappers and vanishings and everything else, which apparently doesn't scare Alice. Only the stuff that has a hint of the supernatural keeps Alice awake at night.
It's true. What can I say? Well, Brett, this has been amazing. I can't wait to come back for less scary episodes with you.
Yes, but we will be back next week with some of those traditional, non-scary, and yet horrible true crime cases that you all love. But until then, happy Halloween, everyone. I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors.
You're the best.
You're the best.
You're the best.
You're the best. Okay, are you ready? We got business to do here, Alice.
I've been ready. I was born ready.
You were born ready.
I was born ready.
Sad it's our last October episode.
I mean, it's all about murder. Every episode is October.
It's true. It's true.
Despite what everybody says.
This one's really long, so we're just gonna have to.
Okay, I'm disciplined. Like, it really, really is.
It's fascinating.
It was started by someone who didn't want to lose their job.
I know. Isn't that crazy?
I mean, like, when you strip it all down, it's like the guy didn't want to lose his job.
Yeah, he didn't want to lose his job. So, what better way to do that than accuse people of being a witch?
Yeah.
Oh, it's my daughter who says you're a witch. What me?
So crazy.
All this month, celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month with PlutoTV. Watch movies like Compadres and the Spy Kids trilogy, or your favorite stars like Luis Gerardo Mendez in Camino a Marte. Plus, PlutoTV has thousands more movies and TV shows and over 45 channels in Spanish, all for free. So download the PlutoTV app on all your favorite devices and start streaming today. PlutoTV. Drop in, watch free.